Morning, everyone. I don't know if you've ever had this experience of going to a restaurant and ordering more food than you need. That's never happened for you, I'm sure. But I remember recently I went to Wendy's, to the drive-thru, and typically, I'll order a Dave single, right? One patty, it's just the right number of meat for a hamburger. But on that day, I decided I was going to compromise a little bit. I was going to go for the Dave's double patty hamburger, right? You know what they say, twice the patty, twice the party, right? Nobody says that. Just me. So I drive on up there and I say, I like the Dave's double combo, little compromise. And she said, yeah, sure, so no problem, sir. Would you like a Frosty with that? Oh. Yeah, I'd like a Frosty with that, another little compromise. And then she said, oh, great, sir, and would you like to upsize your meal? Yeah, I'd like to upsize my meal too, right? And then I don't know what came over me, I think half jokingly, but also perhaps with a prick of my conscience. I started to say, look, I know this is really excessive. I don't normally do this, I usually just get the single. I know it's a lot. Don't judge me. It's been a long week. There's a nice long pause. That'll be $9.57, sir. Please proceed to the first drive-thru window. So I pull on up there, and this is the best part because, I open the window opens, and the lady comes over, and I go to offer, go to pay. And she says, you know what, sir? You shouldn't be ashamed of what you ordered. People order that kind of thing all the time. It's perfectly normal. It's acceptable. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I thought, wow, this is like free therapy session in the Wendy's drive-thru. And so I said to myself, yeah, you know what? Other people order this kind of thing. This is normal. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with me. The compromise. And then I rationalize. Compare myself to what's acceptable for other people. And I think we do that sometimes, don't we? We compromise, we do things we know we probably shouldn't do, and then we make rationalizations. Well, other people are doing it too. It's normal, it's not a big deal, and we give ourselves a pass. I'll give you a more personal example and a little bit more vulnerable. Now, I know, and you probably might think to yourself, just looking at Father Simon and myself, that they are obviously letting just about anybody into the priesthood these days. But that is actually not true. In fact, before I even was able to begin to study for the priesthood, I had to undergo a whole series of tests, including a psych eval. And so I remember undergoing this psych eval, and 300 questions later, I sat down with a psychologist to interview me and go through this. Actually, turns out Father Simon didn't go through a psych eval test until much later, which explains a couple things, They say, you actually don't have to be crazy to be a priest, but it does help a little bit, So I sat down, wrote this test, had this interview with the psychologist, and everything went well. And later on, I got results, kind of a breakdown of the findings later on. And I remember reading through it, and I thought, discovered all these sorts of interesting things about myself. I said, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. And then I came to something that absolutely floored me. And it said this: at risk for alcoholism. And I remember thinking to myself, my first reaction was, obviously this guy doesn't know anything about me. But upon further reflection on that, I realized that I had been blind to this because, and here's why, because I had spent all kinds of time with other people who were excessive drinkers. And so I compared my behavior to theirs, and I rationalized it away. I had compromised the way I was living my life, and I said, everybody else is doing it, so it's normal. It's fine. It's not a big deal. We compromise, and then we rationalize. Now, this is kind of a human problem. It's a struggle. It's something that we do. We can often rationalize away certain behaviors based on the culture in which we live, the culture of the people around us. And we see a similar kind of dynamic at work, in fact, in some of the scriptures we read today, particularly that first reading from the book of Maccabees. And I just want to give you a little bit of historical context to set this up. It was approximately the year 170 BCE. The king Antiochus Epiphanes came to power in the Seleucid Empire. And the area of Judea, which is modern-day Israel, Palestine, was in the Seleucid Empire at the time. The king Antiochus began a program of Hellenization of the whole empire. That means he began installing Greek culture throughout the Seleucid Empire. Now, like every human culture, this is inevitably a mix of both good and bad. There's good elements and positive elements in every culture. Some of the positive elements include, strong civil institutions, beautiful art and architecture. They introduced theater and had great philosophy, poetry, and perhaps Greece's greatest contribution to the progress of humanity, souvlaki, right? Delicious. But at the same time, King Antiochus required something that was not so good, particularly for the Jews who lived in Judea. They required Greek religious practice. They required that everybody across the empire offer sacrifice to the gods of the Greek culture. This is a clear violation of their faith, right? The first commandment, thou shalt have no false, I'm the Lord your God, and thou shalt have no false gods before me. And so the culture in which they lived came into conflict with their own belief, their own faith, their own practice, their own traditions. Now, many Jews, they compromised. Many Jews, they went along with this process of Hellenization. They gave up their own religious practices, or in public, they worshiped Greek gods, and in private, they worshiped their own gods. But not all the Jews did that. There were a group that refused to compromise. That includes one heroic mother and her 7 sons, which we read about in the first reading. Now, all of them, the mother and the 7 sons, refused to offer sacrifice to the Greek gods. All of them were urged by their contemporaries, their friends, their family. Look, everybody else is doing it. It's not a big deal. And even if you do it, you don't have to mean it, right? Just do it out publicly, do it outwardly. You don't actually have to mean what you're doing. You're just doing it to protect yourselves, to save your family. The rationalization. But they refused. And so all 7 of them, along with their mother, were brought before the court of King Antiochus. And one by one, the brothers were offered success. They were offered wealth. They were offered luxury. They were offered power, if only they would turn their back on their faith. And their mother, their heroic mother, encouraged them to be courageous, to refuse to compromise what they believed, to refuse to compromise their faith, and to rather accept death than betray the faith and their God. One of the brothers said, when faced with the temptation or to compromise, said, "The King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life. because we have died for his laws. In other words, he was keeping before him the reality of his eternal destiny. Another brother facing torture and death sums it all up. He says, "We are ready to die rather than transgress the laws of our ancestors." The courage. And they did, each one of them, tortured and then executed for what they believed, because they refused to compromise the truth in which they believed. That there is one God, and he alone should be worshiped. Now, I feel like the message for us today is this. I feel like Jesus is calling us today to live this faith, the faith that has been entrusted to us, without compromise, without rationalizing our compromise, to stand up and to say, yes, I will believe, and I will pay the consequences of that. And honestly, it's not easy. We do it all the time. I compromise all the time. In fact, sometimes I find it difficult, if I'm honest, just to make the sign of the cross in a restaurant before I say grace. I'll hesitate. Now, the question isn't if we compromise our faith, but where? Where in our lives? Where am I compromising my faith today? In my own actions, in my own way of life? Is there an area in my life where I am not currently fully living the call that God has placed on my life? Perhaps there's an area of your life you've been holding back. A teaching of the church you've been struggling to accept. A behavior you don't want to stop. A sacrifice you've been afraid to make. And my suggestion is this, just a simple prayer. To bring this area of your heart, your life, before Jesus and say, Jesus, I don't know if I have the strength, I don't know if I have the courage, but I surrender this area of my life into your hands. That you would be my strength, that you would be my grace, that you would be my courage. I want to bring this back to the psych eval, because after I got that psych eval, I was about 22, 23 years old, and it sparked some really deep self-reflection in my life, and I realized I had been living a compromised life. I realized that my relationship with drinking was preventing me from living fully the call that God had placed on my life. And up to that point, I had been rationalizing my behavior. And so I made the decision that by the grace of God, I was going to stop. I was going to quit drinking for 10 years. Not that I had the courage to do it, not that I actually thought I was capable of doing it, not that I thought I had the strength to do it, but that I was willing to do it by the grace of God. And I remember that being a totally terrifying prospect for me. Why? Because it was so deeply embedded in my personality, in the way I related to people around me, and the things I did for fun, the way I interacted with my friends, the way I met new people. It helped me deal with things like social anxiety, helped me escape my own demons and hide from myself. And it was hard to picture my life without it. And I remember praying, honestly, Jesus, I don't know if I have the power to stop. But if you want me to stop compromising in this area of my life, you need to do it in me. And it was pretty amazing what happened. I stopped drinking. There were consequences to that. My friends group changed. We kind of parted directions. They wanted different things than I wanted. They valued different things than I valued. But Jesus brought new people into my life, people who wanted what I wanted, and were headed in the direction that I was headed. I experienced over time a healing of social anxiety, and I experienced a deeper inner healing of my heart. And over time, I experienced that Jesus walking with me, drawing close to me, and experienced a deeper trust in God and His plan and His purpose for my life. And I experienced a deeper freedom that up to that point I had never known before. And I believe that today, God is looking for people who will stand up and say, I will not compromise anymore. Not people who think they have it all together and are strong enough and have the courage and the strength to do it, but people who will say, God, I am willing to surrender this area of my life to you because it is preventing me from living the fullness of the life that you've called me to live. I believe that God is calling, looking for heroic witnesses to the truth of our faith, like He did with those 7 brothers and their mother who stood up and said, we will not compromise the things that we believe. And I believe that God is calling us to live the gospel without compromise. And so will we be that people? Will we say yes? And will we surrender our lives to the God of the universe, who gave us life and breath and all things?